are different types of texture in visual art, but today we're focusing on painting and drawing. In sculpture, most texture is pretty self-evident.
The first kind of texture is real or actual texture on the surface of the substrate. There are many different ways to achieve this. You might use heavy-bodied acrylic paint. You can add impasto medium to your paint to get those rich brush strokes of paint or painting knife edges to stand out on the canvas. We describe that as painterly. To make the surface of the canvas sit out even more proudly, you could use spackle, plaster of Paris or silicone, or some other kind of sealer or gap filler from a tube or application gun you get at Bunnings. You can add other materials like sand or salt or things like that to your paint to give it texture. You can tear up little tiny pieces of facial tissue and mix it with a medium and or paint. You can glue crepe paper, tin foil or cellophane to the base, and when it's dry, paint over it. Now there are many mediums you can buy and use straight out of the pot. The most valuable tip we can give you before you try applying actual texture to your work is to get your composition laid out first. Unless you are committed to intuitive art another time, don't just randomly daub or make texture on your substrate and work from that. Have a plan, because once the texture is on, it takes a lot to get it off if you ever can. The texture is not usually the subject or focal point, so establish that before you begin. Lay out your composition, doing the background first. You manipulate the texture, not the other way around. I wish someone had told me that before I started to muck around with texture. What it can do is draw attention to or away from a focal point. It can also be added later. The second most important tip is to let the texture paste dry well before going any further. Really dry, somewhere between 2 hours if it is very thin and up to a week if it is thick. Don't let little peaks stick out so much that they're going to get knocked and perhaps come off. That's bad.
Bad! Before you get excited and think, oh, I can use a hairdryer, I'm sorry, but you can't. You need to let it dry naturally. If you force it, it will dry at different rates and will be unstable.
Once dry, you can add more texture if you like. Apply it unevenly to see what effects you can get. A smooth swipe of modelling paste over canvas, painted once dry, with a transparent colour gives a fabulous glow from the whiteness of the paste. It doesn't work with gel or anything that dries clear. Thick areas contrast with thin areas. You can press something textured into the paste while to make imprints on your substrate. You can also push modelling paste through something with holes in it, like lace or fly wire. Then, once partly set, remove the textured thing. You can actually stick fabric, cotton, wrapping paper or small rope to your work. I've used cushion stuffing.
The second kind of texture is the implied texture. The illusion of texture is a tool that you can use to add more interest or detail to whatever visual art you're making. You can just paint it. The illusion of texture combines the sense of sight and touch in your viewer. Whether it's real or imagined, the surface of your work will remain smooth. Your first step is to establish your form and get it looking exactly the shape that you want. Afterwards, you need to consider the detail. Once you've created the illusion of form, you're going to create the illusion of texture. This is more form, but usually smaller things. So things like hair, fur, scales maybe, anything that tells you something about the surface is your later details. When you are painting, particularly if you're painting a still life, have a really close look and consider what the surface characteristics might be. Some of them might not be obvious. For example, you might think that a bald form, like a mushroom, doesn't have a lot of texture, but they do, and it helps us to recognise what they are. The degree of matteness or the shine on them can tell us a lot about that surface. Other things like the weight or the transparency can help show whether it's soft or squishy or hard, and it gives us more information about the object. This roughly painted egg has a different level of shine to it than, for example, the potato. The detail in the surface of the potato helps the viewer to identify it. It's not a real potato, of course, it's a painting of a potato. But back to potatoes. Okay, so if it's a potato that is just been fresh out the ground, it's going to look quite different to one that's been scrubbed. When they're scrubbed, they can get a nice little shine on them. If it's covered in dirt, that's another texture again that you're going to have to imply. In addition to these basic forms, look closely at the surface of things like, for example, bean bags, balloons that have begun to deflate, marshmallows, soft pillows, cushions. They might have a picture or a design or embroidery on them. Stitching is a common type of texture we need to apply when we're doing portraits because there's usually clothing involved. Have a really close look at the subject that you're painting because you might find that the texture of it might only be visible under certain light conditions. So, for example, fabric. If you've got texture of velvet, for example, it might only be where the light catches that you need to go into that detail. Now, you know that things can be soft and squishy, or they can be hard or soft-edged. When we're trying to demonstrate that, we can use the shadow and the shine. We can use the edges. Are they soft or are they fuzzy or soft-edged? We can use highly contrasting light or just a soft glow. And of course, the shape of the shine, how that moves over the surface, will also give us information. Implied texture most often is the later stage of a painting. So your first part of it, you're blocking your painting in, you're establishing form, and then you're zhuzhing it and doing your final details. Those final details and the textures, that's the latter part. This is if you're using implied texture. So not lumpy paint, smooth surface, but made to look like it's lumpy. Another way to create implied texture is with actual texture. So take a leaf, for example, and stamp it. In that way, you're going to be recording the texture onto the surface of your work. Of course, you can also draw texture. It does take some time, and the principle is the same. You start with your broad general areas, and then you work out the finer detail. So big shapes to small shapes, and a little bit of shading at the end. If you are trying to get some implied texture, remember that it takes time. It's not an instant thing, particularly if you're drawing. Texture takes time.
These kinds of texture are somewhat obvious, but painters can highlight what could be considered nature's texture. It's less apparent, but the Impressionists, for instance, were aiming to paint light, atmospheric conditions, for example. Some texture is imagined by artists, where their topic is not tangible, none more so than Kandinsky, described as a painter of sound and vision. Mondrian had a passion for jazz and, oddly, conversely, a desire for order and city lights. The correlation between painting and music has been investigated by academics, scholars and artists for approximately a century. In summary, any kind of texture may add interest or another dimension to your art making. Thank you for watching.